Mr. Glowry. You are leaving England, Mr. Cypress. There is a delightful melancholy in saying farewell to an old acquaintance, when the chances are 20-1 against ever meeting again. A smiling bumper to a sad parting, and let us all be unhappy together. Mr. Cypress, filling a bumper. This is the only social habit that the disappointed spirit never unlearns. The Reverend Mr. Larynx, filling. It is the only piece of academical learning that the finished educatee retains. Mr. Flosky, filling. It is the only objective fact which the skeptic can realize. Scythrop, filling. It is the only styptic for a bleeding heart. The Honorable Mr. Listless, filling. It is the only trouble, and is very well worth taking. Mr. Asterius, filling. It is the only key of conversational truth. Mr. Toobad, filling. It is the only antidote to the great wrath of the devil. Mr. Hilary, filling. It is the only symbol of perfect life. The inscription Hic non bibitur will suit nothing but a tombstone. Mr. Glowry. You will see many fine old ruins, Mr. Cypress, crumbling pillars and mossy walls, many a one-legged Venus and headless Minerva, many a Neptune buried in sand, many a Jupiter turned topsy-turvy, many a perforated Bacchus doing duty as a water-pipe, many reminiscences of the ancient world, which I hope was better worth living in than the modern, though, for myself, I care not a straw more for one than the other, and would not go 20 miles to see anything that either could show. Mr. Cypress. It is something to seek, Mr. Glowry. The mind is restless, and must persist in seeking, though to find is to be disappointed. Do you feel no aspirations towards the countries of Socrates and Cicero? No wish to wander among the venerable remains of the greatness that is past forever? Mr. Glowry. Not a grain. Scythrop. It is indeed much the same as if a lover should dig up the buried form of his mistress, and gaze upon relics which are anything but herself, to wander among a few mouldy ruins that are only imperfect indexes to lost volumes of glory, and meet at every step the more melancholy ruins of human nature, a degenerate race of stupid and shriveled slaves, groveling in the lowest depths of servility and superstition. The Honorable Mr. Listless. It is the fashion to go abroad. I have thought of it myself, but am hardly equal to the exertion. To be sure, a little eccentricity and originality are allowable in some cases, and the most eccentric and original of all characters is an Englishman who stays at home. Scythrop. I should have no pleasure in visiting countries that are past all hope of regeneration. There is great hope of our own, and it seems to me that an Englishman, who, either by his station in society, or by his genius, or, as in your instance, Mr. Cypress, by both, has the power of essentially serving his country in its arduous struggle with its domestic enemies, yet forsakes his country, which is still so rich in hope, to dwell in others which are only fertile in the ruin of memory, does what none of those ancients, whose fragmentary memorials you venerate, would have done in similar circumstances. Mr. Cypress. Sir, I have quarrelled with my wife, and a man who has quarrelled with his wife is absolved from all duty to his country. I have written an ode to tell people as much, and they may take it as they list. Scythrop. Do you suppose, if Brutus had quarrelled with his wife, he would have given it as a reason to Cassius for having nothing to do with his enterprise? Or would Cassius have been satisfied with such an excuse? Mr. Flosky. Brutus was a senator. So is our dear friend. But the cases are different. Brutus had some hope of political good. Mr. Cyprus has none. How should he, after what we have seen in France? Scythrop. A Frenchman is born in harness, ready saddled, bitted and bridled, for any tyrant to ride. He will fawn under his rider one moment, and throw him and kick him to death the next. But another adventurer springs on his back, and by dint of whip and spur on he goes as before. We may, without much vanity, hope better of ourselves. Mr. Cyprus. I have no hope for myself or for others. Our life is of false nature. It is not in the harmony of things. It is an all-blasting upas, whose root is earth, and whose leaves are the skies which rain their poisoned dews upon mankind. We wither from our youth. We grasp with unslaked thirst for unattainable good, lured from the first to the last by phantoms, love, fame, ambition, avarice, all idle and all ill, one meteor of many names that vanishes in the smoke of death. Mr. Flosky. A most delightful speech, Mr. Cyprus. A most amiable and instructive philosophy. You have only to impress its truth on the minds of all living men, and life will then indeed be the desert and the solitude, and I must do you, myself, and our mutual friends the justice to observe that let society only give fair play at one and the same time, as I flatter myself it is inclined to do, to your system of morals, and my system of metaphysics, and Scythrop's system of politics, and Mr. Listless's system of manners, and Mr. Toobad's system of religion, and the result will be as fine a mental chaos as even the immortal Kant himself could ever have hoped to see, in the prospect of which I rejoice. Mr. Hilary. Certainly, ancient, it is not a thing to rejoice at. I am one of those who cannot see the good that is to result from all this mystifying and blue deviling of society. The contrast it presents to the cheerful and solid wisdom of antiquity is too forcible not to strike any one who has the least knowledge of classical literature. To represent vice and misery as the necessary accompaniments of genius is as mischievous as it is false, and the feeling is as unclassical as the language in which it is usually expressed. Mr. Toobad. It is our calamity. The devil has come among us, and has begun by taking possession of all the cleverest fellows. Yet, forsooth, this is the enlightened age. Marry, how? Did our ancestors go peeping about with dark lanterns, and do we walk at our ease in broad sunshine? Where is the manifestation of our light? By what symptoms do you recognize it? What are its signs, its tokens, its symptoms, its symbols, its categories, its conditions? What is it and why? How, where, when is it to be seen, felt, and understood? What do we see by it which our ancestors saw not, and which at the same time is worth seeing? We see 100 men hanged, where they saw one. We see 500 transported, where they saw one. We see 5,000 in the workhouse, where they saw one. We see scores of Bible societies, where they saw none. We see paper where they saw gold. We see men in stays where they saw men in armor. We see painted faces where they saw healthy ones. We see children perishing in manufactories where they saw them flourishing in the fields. We see prisons where they saw castles. We see masters where they saw representatives. In short, they saw true men where we see false knaves. They saw Milton, and we see Mr. Sackbut. Mr. Flosky. The false knave, sir, is my honest friend. Therefore I beseech you, let him be countenanced. God forbid but a knave should have some countenance at his friend's request. Mr. Toobad. Good men and true was their common term, like the kalos chagathos of the Athenians. It is so long since men have been either good or true, that it is to be questioned which is most obsolete, the fact or the phraseology. Mr. Cypress. There is no worth nor beauty but in the mind's idea. Love sows the wind and reaps the whirlwind. Confusion, thrice confounded, is the portion of him who rests even for an instant on that most brittle of reeds, the affection of a human being. The sum of our social destiny is to inflict or to endure. Mr. Hilary. Rather to bear and forbear, Mr. Cypress, a maxim which you perhaps despise. Ideal beauty is not the mind's creation. It is real beauty, refined and purified in the mind's alembic, from the alloy which always more or less accompanies it in our mixed and imperfect nature. But still the gold exists in a very ample degree. To expect too much is a disease in the expectant, for which human nature is not responsible, and, in the common name of humanity, I protest against these false and mischievous ravings. To rail against humanity for not being abstract perfection, and against human love for not realizing all the splendid visions of the poets of chivalry, is to rail at the summer for not being all sunshine, and at the rose for not being always in bloom. Mr. Cypress. Human love. Love is not an inhabitant of the earth. We worship him as the Athenians did their unknown god, but broken hearts are the martyrs of his faith, and the eye shall never see the form which fantasy paints, and which passion pursues through paths of delusive beauty, among flowers whose odors are agonies, and trees whose gums are poison. Mr. Hilary. You talk like a Rosicrucian, who will love nothing but a sylph, who does not believe in the existence of a sylph, and who yet quarrels with the whole universe for not containing a sylph. Mr. Cypress. The mind is diseased of its own beauty, and fevers into false creation. The forms which the sculptor's soul has seized exist only in himself. Mr. Flosky. Permit me to decept. They are the mediums of common forms combined and arranged into a common standard. The ideal beauty of the Helen of Xerxes was the combined medium of the real beauty of the virgins of Crotona. Mr. Hilary. But to make ideal beauty the shadow in the water, and, like the dog in the fable, to throw away the substance in catching at the shadow, is scarcely the characteristic of wisdom, whatever it may be of genius. To reconcile man as he is to the world as it is, to preserve and improve all that is good, and destroy or alleviate all that is evil, in physical and moral nature, have been the hope and aim of the greatest teachers and ornaments of our species. I will say, too, that the highest wisdom and the highest genius have been invariably accompanied with cheerfulness. We have sufficient proofs on record that Shakespeare and Socrates were the most festive of companions, but now the little wisdom and genius we have seem to be entering into a conspiracy against cheerfulness. Mr. Too-Bad. How can we be cheerful with the devil among us? The Honorable Mr. Listless. How can we be cheerful when our nerves are shattered? Mr. Flosky. How can we be cheerful when we are surrounded by a reading public that is growing too wise for its betters? Scythrop. How can we be cheerful when our great general designs are crossed every moment by our little particular passions? Mr. Cypress. How can we be cheerful in the midst of disappointment and despair? Mr. Glowry. Let us all be unhappy together. Mr. Hilary. Let us sing a catch. Mr. Glowry. No, a nice tragical ballad, the Norfolk tragedy to the tune of the 100th Psalm. Mr. Hilary. I say a catch. Mr. Glowry. I say no, a song from Mr. Cypress. All. A song from Mr. Cypress. So Mr. Cypress sang, There is a fever of the spirit, the brand of Cain's unresting doom, which in the lone dark souls that bear it glows like the lamp in Tullia's tomb. Unlike that lamp, its subtle fire burns, blasts, consumes its cell, the heart, till, one by one, hope, joy, desire, like dreams of shadowy smoke, depart. When hope, love, life itself are only dust, spectral memories, dead and cold, the unfed fire burns bright and lonely, like that undying lamp of old, and by that dear illumination, till time its clay-built home has rent, thought broods on feeling's desolation, the soul is its own monument. Mr. Glowry. Admirable. Let us all be unhappy together. Mr. Hilary. Now I say again, a catch. The Reverend Mr. Larynx. I am for you. Mr. Hilary. Seaman 3. The Reverend Mr. Larynx. Agreed. I'll be Harry Gill with a voice of 3. Begin. Mr. Hilary and the Reverend Mr. Larynx. Seaman 3, aye, what men be ye? Gotham's 3 wise men we be. Whither in your bowl so free to rake the moon from out the sea? The bowl goes trim, the moon doth shine, and our ballast is old wine, and your ballast is old wine. Who art thou so fast adrift? I am he they called Old Care. Here on board we will thee lift. No, I may not enter there. Wherefore so? 'Tis Jove's decree. In a bowl care may not be. In a bowl care may not be. Fear ye not the waves that roll? No, in charmed bowl we swim. What the charm that floats the bowl? Water may not pass the brim. The bowl goes trim, the moon doth shine, and our ballast is old wine, and your ballast is old wine. This catch was so well executed by the spirit and science of Mr. Hilary, and the deep triune voice of the reverend gentleman, that the whole party, in spite of themselves, caught the contagion and joined in chorus at the conclusion, each raising a bumper to his lips. The bowl goes trim, the moon doth shine, and our ballast is old wine. Mr. Cypress, having his ballast on board, stepped the same evening into his bowl or traveling chariot, and departed to rake seas and rivers, lakes and canals, for the moon of ideal beauty. End of chapter. Chapter 12. It was the custom of the Honourable Mr. Listless, on adjourning from the bottle to the ladies, to retire for a few moments to make a second toilette, that he might present himself in becoming taste. Fatout, attending as usual, appeared with a countenance of great dismay, and informed his master that he had just ascertained that the abbey was haunted. Mrs. Hilary's gentlewoman, for whom Fatout had lately conceived a tendresse, had been, as she expressed it, fritted out of her 17 senses the preceding night, as she was retiring to her bedchamber, by a ghastly figure which she had met stalking along one of the galleries, wrapped in a white shroud, with a bloody turban on its head. She had fainted away with fear, and, when she recovered, she found herself in the dark, and the figure was gone. "Sacre cochon bleu!" exclaimed Fatout, giving very deliberate emphasis to every portion of his terrible oath. "I would not meet the revenant, the ghost, no, not for all the bowl de punch in the world."
"Fatout," said the Honourable Mr. Listless, "did I ever see a ghost?"
"Jamais, monsieur, never."
"Then I hope I never shall, for, in the present shattered state of my nerves, I am afraid it would be too much for me. There, loosen the lace of my stays a little, for really this plebeian practice of eating, not too loose, consider my shape. That will do. And I desire that you bring me no more stories of ghosts, for though I do not believe in such things, yet, when one is awake in the night, one is apt, if one thinks of them, to have fancies that give one a kind of a chill, particularly if one opens one's eyes suddenly on one's dressing-gown, hanging in the moonlight between the bed and the window."
The Honourable Mr. Listless, though he had prohibited Fatout from bringing him any more stories of ghosts, could not help thinking of that which Fatout had already brought, and, as it was uppermost in his mind, when he descended to the tea and coffee cups and the rest of the company in the library, he almost involuntarily asked Mr. Flosky, whom he looked up to as the most oraculous personage, whether any story of any ghost that had ever appeared to any one was entitled to any degree of belief. Mr. Flosky:
"By far the greater number, to a very great degree."
The Honourable Mr. Listless:
"Really, that is very alarming."
Mr. Flosky:
"Sunt gemino somni porto. There are 2 gates through which ghosts find their way to the upper air, fraud and self-delusion. In the latter case, a ghost is a deceptio visus, an ocular spectrum, an idea with the force of a sensation. I have seen many ghosts myself. I dare say there are few in this company who have not seen a ghost."
The Honourable Mr. Listless:
"I am happy to say I never have, for one."
The Reverend Mr. Larynx:
"We have such high authority for ghosts that it is rank skepticism to disbelieve them. Job saw a ghost, which came for the express purpose of asking a question, and did not wait for an answer."
The Honourable Mr. Listless:
"Because Job was too frightened to give one."
The Reverend Mr. Larynx:
"Spectres appeared to the Egyptians during the darkness with which Moses covered Egypt. The witch of Endor raised the ghost of Samuel. Moses and Elias appeared on Mount Tabor. An evil spirit was sent to the army of Sennacherib and exterminated it in a single night.
Mr. Too-Bad, saying, "The devil is come among you, having great wrath." Mr. Flosky, Saint Macarius interrogated a skull which was found in the desert, and made it relate, in presence of several witnesses, what was going forward in hell. Saint Martin of Tours, being jealous of a pretended martyr, who was the rival saint of his neighborhood, called up his ghost, and made him confess that he was damned. Saint-Germain, being on his travels, turned out of an inn a large party of ghosts, who had every night taken possession of the table d'hôte, and consumed a copious supper. Mr. Hilary, jolly ghosts, and no doubt all friars. A similar party took possession of the cellar of Monsieur Suibach, the painter, in Paris, drank his wine, and threw the empty bottles at his head. The Reverend Mr. Larynx, an atrocious act. Mr. Flosky, Pausanias relates that the neighing of horses and the tumult of combatants were heard every night on the field of Marathon, that those who went purposely to hear these sounds suffered severely for their curiosity, but those who heard them by accident passed with impunity. The Reverend Mr. Larynx, I once saw a ghost myself, in my study, which is the last place where anyone but a ghost would look for me. I had not been into it for 3 months, and was going to consult Tillotson, when, on opening the door, I saw a venerable figure in a flannel dressing-gown, sitting in my armchair, and reading my Jeremy Taylor. It vanished in a moment, and so did I, and what it was or what it wanted I have never been able to ascertain. Mr. Flosky, it was an idea with the force of a sensation. It is seldom that ghosts appeal to 2 senses at once, but when I was in Devonshire, the following story was well attested to me. A young woman, whose lover was at sea, returning one evening over some solitary fields, saw her lover sitting on a stile over which she was to pass. Her first emotions were surprise and joy, but there was a paleness and seriousness in his face that made them give place to alarm. She advanced towards him, and he said to her in a solemn voice, "The eye that hath seen me shall see me no more. Thine eye is upon me, but I am not." And with these words he vanished, and on that very day and hour, as it afterwards appeared, he had perished by shipwreck. The whole party now drew round in a circle, and each related some ghostly anecdote, heedless of the flight of time, till, in a pause of the conversation, they heard the hollow tongue of midnight sounding 12. Mr. Hilary, all these anecdotes admit of solution on psychological principles. It is more easy for a soldier, a philosopher, or even a saint, to be frightened at his own shadow, than for a dead man to come out of his grave. Medical writers cite 1,000 singular examples of the force of imagination. Persons of feeble, nervous, melancholy temperament, exhausted by fever, by labor, or by spare diet, will readily conjure up, in the magic ring of their own fantasy, spectres, gorgons, chimeras, and all the objects of their hatred and their love. We are most of us like Don Quixote, to whom a windmill was a giant, and Dulcinea a magnificent princess, all more or less the dupes of our own imagination, though we do not all go so far as to see ghosts, or to fancy ourselves pipkins and teapots. Mr. Flosky, I can safely say I have seen too many ghosts myself to believe in their external existence. I have seen all kinds of ghosts, black spirits and white, red spirits and gray, some in the shapes of venerable old men who have met me in my rambles at noon, some of beautiful young women who have peeped through my curtains at midnight.
The Honorable Mr. Listless.
And have proved, I doubt not, palpable to feeling as to sight.
Mr. Flosky.
By no means, sir. You reflect upon my purity. Myself and my friends, particularly my friend Mr. Sackbut, are famous for our purity. No, sir, genuine untangible ghosts. I live in a world of ghosts. I see a ghost at this moment.
Mr. Flosky fixed his eye on a door at the farther end of the library. The company looked in the same direction. The door silently opened, and a ghastly figure, shrouded in white drapery, with the semblance of a bloody turban on its head, entered and stalked slowly up the apartment. Mr. Flosky, familiar as he was with ghosts, was not prepared for this apparition, and made the best of his way out at the opposite door. Mrs. Hilary and Marionetta followed, screaming. The Honorable Mr. Listless, by 2 turns of his body, rolled first off the sofa and then under it. The Reverend Mr. Larynx leaped up and fled with so much precipitation that he overturned the table on the foot of Mr. Glowry. Mr. Glowry roared with pain in the ear of Mr. Too-Bad. Mr. Too-Bad's alarm so bewildered his senses that, missing the door, he threw up one of the windows, jumped out in his panic, and plunged over head and ears in the moat. Mr. Asterius and his son, who were on the watch for their mermaid, were attracted by the splashing, threw a net over him, and dragged him to land. Scythrop and Mr. Hilary meanwhile had hastened to his assistance, and on arriving at the edge of the moat, followed by several servants with ropes and torches, found Mr. Asterius and Aquarius busy in endeavoring to extricate Mr. Too-Bad from the net, who was entangled in the meshes, and floundering with rage. Scythrop was lost in amazement, but Mr. Hilary saw at one view all the circumstances of the adventure, and burst into an immoderate fit of laughter, on recovering from which he said to Mr. Asterius, "You have caught an odd fish indeed." Mr. Too-Bad was highly exasperated at this unseasonable pleasantry, but Mr. Hilary softened his anger by producing a knife and cutting the Gordian knot of his reticular envelopment.
"You see," said Mr. Too-Bad, "you see, gentlemen, in my unfortunate person, proof upon proof of the present dominion of the devil in the affairs of this world, and I have no doubt but that the apparition of this night was Apollyon himself in disguise, sent for the express purpose of terrifying me into this complication of misadventures. The devil is come among you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time."
End of chapter. Chapter 13. Mr. Glowry was much surprised, on occasionally visiting Scythrop's tower, to find the door always locked, and to be kept sometimes waiting many minutes for admission, during which he invariably heard a heavy rolling sound like that of a ponderous mangle, or of a wagon on a weighing bridge, or of theatrical thunder. He took little notice of this for some time. At length his curiosity was excited, and one day, instead of knocking at the door, as usual, the instant he reached it he applied his ear to the keyhole, and, like Bottom in the Midsummer Night's Dream, spied a voice, which he guessed to be of the feminine gender, and knew to be not Scythrop's,
whose deeper tones he distinguished at intervals. Having attempted in vain to catch a syllable of the discourse, he knocked violently at the door, and roared for immediate admission. The voices ceased. The accustomed rolling sound was heard. The door opened, and Scythrop was discovered alone. Mr. Glowry looked round to every corner of the apartment, and then said, "Where is the lady?" "The lady, sir?" said Scythrop. "Yes, sir, the lady." "Sir, I do not understand you." "You don't, sir." "No, indeed, sir, there is no lady here." "But, sir, this is not the only apartment in the tower, and I make no doubt there is a lady upstairs." "You are welcome to search, sir." "Yes, and while I am searching, she will slip out from some lurking place and make her escape." "You may lock this door, sir, and take the key with you." "But there is the terrace door. She has escaped by the terrace." "The terrace, sir, has no other outlet, and the walls are too high for a lady to jump down." "Well, sir, give me the key." Mr. Glowry took the key, searched every nook of the tower, and returned. "You are a fox, Scythrop. You are an exceedingly cunning fox, with that demure visage of yours. What was that lumbering sound I heard before you opened the door?" "Sound, sir?" "Yes, sir, sound." "My dear sir, I am not aware of any sound except my great table, which I moved on rising to let you in." "The table. Let me see that. No, sir. Not a 10th part heavy enough, not a 10th part." "But, sir, you do not consider the laws of acoustics. A whisper becomes a peal of thunder in the focus of reverberation. Allow me to explain this. Sounds striking on concave surfaces are reflected from them, and, after reflection, converge to points which are the foci of these surfaces. It follows, therefore, that the ear may be so placed in one, so that it shall hear a sound better than when situated nearer to the point of the first impulse. Again, in the case of two concave surfaces, placed opposite to each other— "Nonsense, sir! Don't tell me of foci. Pray, sir, will concave surfaces produce two voices when nobody speaks? I heard two voices, and one was feminine. Feminine, sir. What say you to that?" "Oh, sir, I perceive your mistake. I am writing a tragedy, and was acting over a scene to myself. To convince you, I will give you a specimen, but you must first understand the plot. It is a tragedy on the German model. The great mogul is in exile, and has taken lodgings at Kensington, with his only daughter, the Princess Rancherina, who takes in needlework and keeps a day school. The princess is discovered hemming a set of shirts for the parson of the parish. They are to be marked with a large R. Enter to her the great mogul. A pause, during which they look at each other expressively. The princess changes color several times. The mogul takes snuff in great agitation. Several grains are heard to fall on the stage. His heart is seen to beat through his upper Benjamin. The mogul, with a mournful look at his left shoe— "My shoestring is broken." The princess, after an interval of melancholy reflection— "I know it." The mogul— "My second shoestring. The first broke when I lost my empire. The second is broken today. When will my poor heart break?" The princess— "Shoestrings, hearts, and empires. Mysterious sympathy." "Nonsense, sir," interrupted Mr. Glowry. "That is not at all like the voice I heard." But, sir, said Scythrop, a keyhole may be so constructed as to act like an acoustic tube, and an acoustic tube, sir, will modify sound in a very remarkable manner. Consider the construction of the ear, and the nature and causes of sound. The external part of the ear is a cartilaginous funnel. It won't do, Scythrop. There is a girl concealed in this tower, and find her I will. There are such things as sliding panels and secret closets. He sounded round the room with his cane, but detected no hollowness. I have heard, sir, he continued, that during my absence 2 years ago you had a dumb carpenter closeted with you day after day. I did not dream that you were laying contrivances for carrying on secret intrigues. Young men will have their way. I had my way when I was a young man. But, sir, when your cousin Marionetta— Scythrop now saw that the affair was growing serious. To have clapped his hand upon his father's mouth, to have entreated him to be silent, would, in the first place, not have made him so, and, in the second, would have shown a dread of being overheard by somebody. His only resource, therefore, was to try to drown Mr. Glowry's voice, and having no other subject, he continued his description of the ear, raising his voice continually as Mr. Glowry raised his. When your cousin Marionetta, said Mr. Glowry, whom you profess to love, sir— The internal canal of the ear, said Scythrop, is partly bony and partly cartilaginous. This internal canal is actually in the house, sir, and when you are so shortly to be, as I expect, closed at the further end by the membrana tympani, joined together in holy matrimony, under which is carried a branch of the 5th pair of nerves. I say, sir, when you are so shortly to be married to your cousin Marionetta, the cavitas tympani— A loud noise was heard behind the bookcase, which, to the astonishment of Mr. Glowry, opened in the middle, and the massy compartments, with all their weight of books, receding from each other in the manner of a theatrical scene, with a heavy rolling sound, which Mr. Glowry immediately recognized to be the same which had excited his curiosity, disclosed an interior apartment, in the entrance of which stood the beautiful Stella, who, stepping forward, exclaimed, "Married? Is he going to be married? The profligate!" "Really, madam," said Mr. Glowry, "I do not know what he is going to do, or what I am going to do, or what anyone is going to do, for all this is incomprehensible." "I can explain it all," said Scythrop, "in a most satisfactory manner, if you will but have the goodness to leave us alone." "Pray, sir, to which act of the tragedy of the Great Mogul does this incident belong?" "I entreat you, my dear sir, leave us alone." Stella threw herself into a chair and burst into a tempest of tears. Scythrop sat down by her and took her hand. She snatched her hand away and turned her back upon him. He rose, sat down on the other side, and took her other hand. She snatched it away and turned from him again. Scythrop continued entreating Mr. Glowry to leave them alone, but the old gentleman was obstinate and would not go. "I suppose, after all," said Mr. Glowry maliciously, "it is only a phenomenon in acoustics, and this young lady is the reflection of sound from concave surfaces." Someone tapped at the door. Mr. Glowry opened it, and Mr. Hilary entered. He had been seeking Mr. Glowry, and had traced him to Scythrop's tower. He stood a few moments in silent surprise, and then addressed himself to Mr. Glowry for an explanation. "The explanation," said Mr. Glowry, "is very satisfactory. The Great Mogul has taken lodgings at Kensington, and the external part of the ear is a cartilaginous funnel."
"Mr. Glowry, that is no explanation."
"Mr. Hilary, it is all I know about the matter."
"Sir, this pleasantry is very unseasonable. I perceive that my niece is sported with in a most unjustifiable manner, and I shall see if she will be more successful in obtaining an intelligible answer." And he departed in search of Marionetta. Scythrop was now in a hopeless predicament. Mr. Hilary made a hue and cry in the Abbey, and summoned his wife and Marionetta to Scythrop's apartment. The ladies, not knowing what was the matter, hastened in great consternation. Mr. Twombad saw them sweeping along the corridor, and, judging from their manner that the devil had manifested his wrath in some new shape, followed from pure curiosity. Scythrop meanwhile vainly endeavoured to get rid of Mr. Glowry and to pacify Stella. The latter attempted to escape from the tower, declaring she would leave the Abbey immediately, and he should never see her or hear of her more. Scythrop held her hand and detained her by force, till Mr. Hilary reappeared with Mrs. Hilary and Marionetta. Marionetta, seeing Scythrop grasping the hand of a strange beauty, fainted away in the arms of her aunt. Scythrop flew to her assistance, and Stella, with redoubled anger, sprang towards the door, but was intercepted in her intended flight by being caught in the arms of Mr. Twombad, who exclaimed, "Celinda!" "Papa," said the young lady disconsolately. "The devil is come among you," said Mr. Twombad. "How came my daughter here?" "Your daughter!" exclaimed Mr. Glowry. "Your daughter!" exclaimed Scythrop, and Mr. and Mrs. Hilary. "Yes," said Mr. Twombad, "my daughter Celinda." Marionetta opened her eyes and fixed them on Celinda. Celinda in return fixed hers on Marionetta. They were at remote points of the apartment. Scythrop was equidistant from both of them, central and motionless, like Mahomet's coffin. "Mr. Glowry," said Mr. Twombad, "can you tell by what means my daughter came here?" "I know no more," said Mr. Glowry, "than the Great Mogul." "Mr. Scythrop," said Mr. Twombad, "how came my daughter here?" "I did not know, sir, that the lady was your daughter." "But how came she here?" "By spontaneous locomotion," said Scythrop sullenly. "Celinda," said Mr. Twombad, "what does all this mean?" "I really do not know, sir." "This is most unaccountable. When I told you in London that I had chosen a husband for you, you thought proper to run away from him, and now, to all appearance, you have run away to him." "How, sir, was that your choice?" "Precisely, and if he is yours too, we shall be both of a mind, for the first time in our lives." "He is not my choice, sir. This lady has a prior claim. I renounce him." "And I renounce him," said Marionetta. Scythrop knew not what to do. He could not attempt to conciliate the one without irreparably offending the other, and he was so fond of both that the idea of depriving himself for ever of the society of either was intolerable to him. He therefore retreated into his stronghold, mystery, maintained an impenetrable silence, and contented himself with stealing occasionally a deprecating glance at each of the objects of his idolatry. Mr. Twombad and Mr. Hilary, in the meantime, were each insisting on an explanation from Mr. Glowry, who they thought had been playing a double game on this occasion.
Mr. Glowry was vainly endeavoring to persuade them of his innocence in the whole transaction. Mrs. Hilary was endeavoring to mediate between her husband and brother. The Honorable Mr. Listless, the Reverend Mr. Larynx, Mr. Flosky, Mr. Asterius, and Aquarius were attracted by the tumult to the scene of action, and were appealed to severally and conjointly by the respective disputants. Multitudinous questions and answers en masse composed a charivari to which the genius of Rossini alone could have given a suitable accompaniment, and which was only terminated by Mrs. Hilary and Mr. Too-Bad retreating with the captive damsels. The whole party followed, with the exception of Scythrop, who threw himself into his armchair, crossed his left foot over his right knee, placed the hollow of his left hand on the interior angle of his left leg, rested his right elbow on the elbow of the chair, placed the ball of his right thumb against his right temple, curved the forefinger along the upper part of his forehead, rested the point of the middle finger on the bridge of his nose, and the points of the two others on the lower part of the palm, fixed his eyes intently on the veins in the back of his left hand, and sat in this position like the immovable Theseus, who, as is well known to many who have not been at college, and to some few who have, sedat aeternumque sedebit. We hope the admirers of the minutiae in poetry and romance will appreciate this accurate description of a pensive attitude. End of chapter. Chapter 14. Scythrop was still in this position when Raven entered to announce that dinner was on table. "I cannot come," said Scythrop. Raven sighed. "Something is the matter," said Raven, "but man is born to trouble." "Leave me," said Scythrop. "Go and croak elsewhere." "Thus it is," said Raven. 25 years have I lived in Nightmare Abbey, and now all the reward of my affection is, go and croak elsewhere. I have danced you on my knee, and fed you with marrow." "Good Raven," said Scythrop, "I entreat you to leave me." "Shall I bring your dinner here?" said Raven. "A boiled fowl and a glass of Madeira are prescribed by the faculty in cases of low spirits. But you had better join the party. It is very much reduced already." "Reduced? How?" "The Honourable Mr. Listless is gone. He declared that, what with family quarrels in the morning and ghosts at night, he could get neither sleep nor peace, and that the agitation was too much for his nerves, though Mr. Glowry assured him that the ghost was only poor Crow walking in his sleep, and that the shroud and bloody turban were a sheet and a red nightcap." "Well, sir?" "The Reverend Mr. Larynx has been called off on duty to marry or bury, I don't know which, some unfortunate person or persons at Claydyke. But man is born to trouble." "Is that all?" "No, Mr. Too-Bad is gone too, and a strange lady with him." "Gone?" "Gone. And Mr. and Mrs. Hilary, and Miss O'Carroll, they are all gone. There is nobody left but Mr. Asterius and his son, and they are going tonight." "Then I have lost them both." "Won't you come to dinner?" "No." "Shall I bring your dinner here?" "Yes." "What will you have?" "A pint of port and a pistol." "A pistol?" "And a pint of port. I will make my exit like Werter. Go." "Stay." Did Miss O'Carroll say anything? No. Did Miss Toobad say anything? The strange lady? No. Did either of them cry? No. What did they do? Nothing. What did Mr. Toobad say? He said 50 times over the devil was come among us. And they are gone? Yes, and the dinner is getting cold. There is a time for everything under the sun. You may as well dine first and be miserable afterwards. True, Raven, there is something in that. I will take your advice. Therefore, bring me the port and the pistol? No, the boiled fowl and Madeira. Scythrop had dined, and was sipping his Madeira alone, immersed in melancholy musing, when Mr. Glowry entered, followed by Raven, who, having placed an additional glass and set a chair for Mr. Glowry, withdrew. Mr. Glowry sat down opposite Scythrop. After a pause, during which each filled and drank in silence, Mr. Glowry said, "So, sir, you have played your cards well. I proposed Miss Toobad to you. You refused her. Mr. Toobad proposed you to her. She refused you. You fell in love with Marionetta, and were going to poison yourself, because, from pure fatherly regard to your temporal interests, I withheld my consent. When at length I offered you my consent, you told me I was too precipitate. And after all, I find you and Miss Toobad living together in the same tower, and behaving in every respect like two plighted lovers. Now, sir, if there be any rational solution of all this absurdity, I shall be very much obliged to you for a small glimmering of information." "The solution, sir, is of little moment, but I will leave it in writing for your satisfaction. The crisis of my fate is come. The world is a stage, and my direction is exit." "Do not talk so, sir. Do not talk so, Scythrop. What would you have?" "I would have my love." "And pray, sir, who is your love?" "Celinda? Marionetta? Either. Both." "Both? That may do very well in a German tragedy, and the great Mogul might have found it very feasible in his lodgings at Kensington, but it will not do in Lincolnshire. Will you have Miss Toobad?" "Yes." "And renounce Marionetta?" "No." "But you must renounce one." "I cannot." "And you cannot have both. What is to be done?" "I must shoot myself." "Don't talk so, Scythrop. Be rational, my dear Scythrop. Consider, and make a cool, calm choice, and I will exert myself in your behalf." "Why should I choose, sir? Both have renounced me. I have no hope of either." "Tell me which you will have, and I will plead your cause irresistibly." "Well, sir, I will have— No, sir, I cannot renounce either. I cannot choose either. I am doomed to be the victim of eternal disappointments, and I have no resource but a pistol." "Scythrop, Scythrop, if one of them should come to you, what then?" "That, sir, might alter the case, but that cannot be." "It can be, Scythrop. It will be. I promise you it will be. Have but a little patience. but a week's patience, and it shall be. A week, sir, is an age, but to oblige you, as a last act of filial duty, I will live another week. It is now Thursday evening, 25 minutes past 7. At this hour and minute, on Thursday next, love and fate shall smile on me, or I will drink my last pint of port in this world. Mr. Glowry ordered his travelling chariot, and departed from the abbey. End of chapter.
Chapter 15.
The day after Mr. Glowry's departure was one of incessant rain, and Scythrop repented of the promise he had given. The next day was one of bright sunshine. He sat on the terrace, read a tragedy of Sophocles, and was not sorry, when Raven announced dinner, to find himself alive. On the third evening, the wind blew and the rain beat, and the owl flapped against his windows, and he put a new flint in his pistol. On the fourth day, the sun shone again, and he locked the pistol up in a drawer, where he left it undisturbed till the morning of the eventful Thursday, when he ascended the turret with a telescope and spied anxiously along the road that crossed the fens from Claydyke. But nothing appeared on it. He watched in this manner from 10 a.m. till Raven summoned him to dinner at 5, when he stationed Crow at the telescope and descended to his own funeral feast. He left open the communications between the tower and turret, and called aloud at intervals to Crow, "Crow? Crow, is anything coming?" Crow answered, "The wind blows, and the windmills turn, but I see nothing coming." And at every answer, Scythrop found the necessity of raising his spirits with a bumper. After dinner, he gave Raven his watch to set by the abbey clock. Raven brought it, Scythrop placed it on the table, and Raven departed. Scythrop called again to Crow, and Crow, who had fallen asleep, answered mechanically, "I see nothing coming." Scythrop laid his pistol between his watch and his bottle. The hour hand passed the 7. The minute hand moved on. It was within 3 minutes of the appointed time. Scythrop called again to Crow. Crow answered as before. Scythrop rang the bell. Raven appeared. "Raven," said Scythrop, "the clock is too fast." "No, indeed," said Raven, who knew nothing of Scythrop's intentions. "If anything, it is too slow." "Villain," said Scythrop, pointing the pistol at him, "it is too fast." Yes, too fast, I meant," said Raven in manifest fear. "How much too fast?" said Scythrop. "As much as you please," said Raven. "How much, I say?" said Scythrop, pointing the pistol again. "An hour, a full hour, sir," said the terrified butler. "Put back my watch," said Scythrop. Raven, with trembling hand, was putting back the watch when the rattle of wheels was heard in the court, and Scythrop, springing down the stairs by 3 steps together, was at the door in sufficient time to have handed either of the young ladies from the carriage if she had happened to be in it. But Mr. Glowry was alone. "I rejoice to see you," said Mr. Glowry. "I was fearful of being too late, for I waited till the last moment in the hope of accomplishing my promise. But all my endeavors have been vain, as these letters will show." Scythrop impatiently broke the seals. The contents were these: "Almost a stranger in England, I fled from parental tyranny and the dread of an arbitrary marriage to the protection of a stranger and a philosopher, whom I expected to find something better than, or at least something different from, the rest of his worthless species, could I, after what has occurred, have expected nothing more from you than the commonplace impertinence of sending your father to treat with me and with mine for me? I should be a little moved in your favor if I could believe you capable of carrying into effect the resolutions which your father says you have taken, in the event of my proving inflexible, though I doubt not you will execute them as far as relates to the pint of wine, twice over, at least. I wish you much happiness with Miss O'Carroll. I shall always cherish a grateful recollection of Nightmare Abbey, for having been the means of introducing me to a true transcendentalist, and though he is a little older than myself, which is all one in Germany, I shall very soon have the pleasure of subscribing myself. Celinda Flusky. I hope, my dear cousin, that you will not be angry with me, but that you will always think of me as a sincere friend, who will always feel interested in your welfare. I am sure you love Miss Toobad much better than me, and I wish you much happiness with her. Mr. Listless assures me that people do not kill themselves for love nowadays, though it is still the fashion to talk about it. I shall, in a very short time, change my name and situation, and shall always be happy to see you in Berkeley Square, when, to the unalterable designation of your affectionate cousin, I shall subjoin the signature of Marionetta Listless. Scythrop tore both letters to atoms, and railed in good set terms against the fickleness of women. "Calm yourself, my dear Scythrop," said Mr. Glowry. "There are yet maidens in England." "Very true, sir," said Scythrop. "And the next time," said Mr. Glowry, "have but one string to your bow." "Very good advice, sir," said Scythrop. "And besides," said Mr. Glowry, "the fatal time is past, for it is now almost 8. "Then that villain Raven," said Scythrop, "deceived me when he said that the clock was too fast. But, as you observe very justly, the time has gone by, and I have just reflected that these repeated crosses in love qualify me to take a very advanced degree in misanthropy, and there is, therefore, good hope that I may make a figure in the world. But I shall ring for the rascal Raven and admonish him." Raven appeared. Scythrop looked at him very fiercely 2 or 3 minutes, and Raven, still remembering the pistol, stood quaking in mute apprehension, till Scythrop, pointing significantly toward the dining-room, said, "Bring some Madeira." The end.